The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, which was how Minnie Hadley would always remember it, because Tuesdays in Caldwell, Kansas were the slowest days of the week, and slow days had a way of making a person feel the particular weight of loneliness more than any other. It was the spring of 1882, and Minnie had been living above her father's dry goods store for 3 years since his health had begun to fail, managing the accounts and the inventory and the endless parade of dusty trail hands who came through wanting flour and tobacco and nothing much else. She was 23 years old, with dark hair pinned so tight it gave her headaches, and she had a habit of pressing her fingers to the window pane on cold mornings just to feel something sharp and real. She was not unhappy, exactly, but she was not anywhere close to happy, either. The letter had come through the Cattlemen's Association Pen Pal program, which her friend Dora Hutchins had convinced her to join the previous fall. Dora had read about it in a women's gazette out of Kansas City, a program that matched respectable single women with respectable single men across the territories, so that lonely people might find companionship through correspondence. Minnie had resisted for 2 months before Dora wore her down one rainy October afternoon with 3 cups of strong tea and a very convincing speech about the statistical likelihood of finding a good man in Caldwell on her own. So Minnie had written a careful, measured letter introducing herself, and the association had matched her with a man whose chosen name on the registry was listed simply as S. Rourke, rancher, of Wichita, Kansas. Wichita. Minnie had looked at that word on the paper and felt something quietly hopeful move through her chest. Wichita was 40 miles away. Not so far that correspondence would take weeks, but far enough that the romance of distance could do its particular work. She had written back to the address the association provided, which was a post office box in Wichita, and she had waited. His first letter had arrived on a Tuesday, which was why Tuesdays would always carry a certain electricity after that. He wrote with a firm, economical hand that still somehow managed warmth. He said he was 26 years old and had been working cattle since he was 16. He said he owned a modest spread of land just outside of town, 40 acres that he had purchased himself with money earned and saved over 9 years of work. He said he had a horse named Copper and a barn cat named General Grant who was ungrateful but effective at his job. He said he had grown up in Missouri and come west at 17 because the West had seemed like a place where a man could be exactly who he chose to be, which Minnie found to be the most honest thing any person had said to her in recent memory. She wrote back immediately. She told him about the dry goods store and her father, whose name was Harold and whose lungs had given him trouble since the winter of 1879. She told him about Dora, who was married and relentlessly cheerful, and who treated Minnie's correspondence as her own personal serialized novel. She told him about Caldwell, which sat right along the Kishom Trail, and so received every kind of person the West had to offer, from cattle barons to trail cooks to the occasional wanted man, who did not know or did not care that Caldwell had a new marshal who took his work seriously. She told him that she had grown up wanting to be a school teacher, but had never quite managed to make it happen, and that she still thought about it sometimes when the store was quiet, and the afternoon light came through the front glass in long flat ribbons. He wrote back in 11 days, which was good time between Caldwell and Wichita in 1882, and she read his response standing at the counter because she could not wait long enough to go upstairs. He said that he thought she sounded like a person who had chosen duty over desire, and that he respected it enormously, but that he hoped someday the desire might win. He said he had tried once to read law from a correspondence course, but that cows had a way of demanding your attention at precisely the wrong moment, and he had not gotten past chapter 4. He said he thought Caldwell sounded like a proper Western town, and that he had heard of it on the trail, which told her something about his work. He said he looked forward to knowing her better. That was October. By November they were writing twice a month. By December, they were writing once a week. By January, the letters had grown so long and detailed and alive with feeling that Minnie had taken to writing in the evenings after her father went to bed, sitting at the small pine table in the kitchen with the lamp pulled close, her pen moving across the paper in a kind of private joy she had not expected to feel. She learned things about Seth Rourke in increments, the way you learn things about a person when the only currency between you is words. She learned that he had a younger sister named Clara who lived in Missouri and who wrote to him infrequently but whose letters he kept in a tin box under his bed. She learned that he could not abide dishonesty in any form and had once ended a cattle partnership over a falsified count that had cost him less than $10 because it was the principle that mattered. She learned that he had a laugh, or so he described it, that was embarrassingly loud for a man who generally kept to himself. She learned that he read whatever he could get his hands on, and that his favorite book was a battered copy of David Copperfield that had been given to him by a schoolteacher in Missouri when he was 14, and that the pages were held together now mostly by habit and stubbornness. She wrote to him about things she had never said aloud to anyone, about the particular grief of watching her father shrink inside himself, and how it felt to love someone whose light was slowly going out. About the way she sometimes stood at the edge of the town in the early morning before anyone else was awake and looked south toward the open prairie and felt something wordless and enormous that she could not name. About how she believed that the West was both the most beautiful and most brutal place in the world, and that those two things were not in conflict. He wrote back about how he felt something similar when he rode the eastern pasture at dawn, when the light was still pink and the grass was silver with dew, and the only sound was Copper's breathing and the distant lowing of cattle. He said it was the one time in his day when he felt completely and entirely himself. He said reading her letters felt something like that. Minnie had to put that particular letter down for a moment and look at the ceiling. The months turned. February brought a hard freeze that damaged some of her father's stock and kept the store closed for 4 days, and she wrote Seth a long letter about the boredom and frustration of being snowed in, and he wrote back with such careful and specific advice about checking for frost damage on goods stored near outside walls that she realized he had clearly spent time in commerce at some point, and she asked him about it. He wrote back saying he had worked 2 winters in a hardware store in Abilene when cattle work dried up, and that it had taught him more about human nature than the trail ever had, because hardware customers had expectations and trail hands had only needs. By March they were writing about themselves in ways that felt tender and private, and Minnie had begun to think, with a kind of careful deliberateness, about what it might mean to meet this man. She had not suggested it. Neither had he. There was an unspoken agreement in their correspondence, she felt, to let the words do their work before the world was allowed in. But she thought about it. She thought about it when she woke in the morning, and when she was measuring out coffee beans by the pound, and when the store was empty in the late afternoon, and the dust motes moved through the slanted light like something alive. In April, her father had a bad week and she did not write for 10 days, and when she finally did the letter was short and exhausted and a little raw. She wrote that she was tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, and that she was afraid, and that she was sorry to be saying it to him because it was not the kind of thing you said in a letter. He wrote back in 8 days, which was faster than usual, and the letter was 3 pages long. He told her that a letter was exactly the place to say that kind of thing, because a letter was honest in a way that conversation sometimes could not manage, because you had to commit it to paper, and there was no taking it back, and that commitment was its own kind of bravery. He told her that watching someone you love diminish was one of the hardest things a person could carry, and that she should not be ashamed of the weight of it. He told her that his own father had died when he was 20, and that he had not known how to grieve it properly until years later, and that he wished someone had simply told him that grief did not follow a schedule, and that you could be fine and not fine at the same time, and both were true. Minnie read that letter at the kitchen table and cried quietly and felt, for the first time in a long while, not alone. By May they were something. She could not say what exactly. There was no word that quite fit a connection built entirely from paper and ink and 40 miles of Kansas prairie. But whatever it was real to her. It was the most real thing she had touched in years. And then, in May, something else happened. Dora Hutchins came into the store on a Wednesday with her basket over her arm and her eyes bright with the particular light they got when she had news she could not wait to deliver. She set her basket on the counter and leaned forward on both elbows with the breathless energy of a woman who had been saving this up all morning. "I saw the Whitmore boys at the livery this morning," Dora said, naming 2 brothers who were regular customers and who worked on a spread south of town. "And they told me something that I believe you are going to find very interesting." "I am busy, Dora," Minnie said, though she was not particularly. "There is a new cattle operation setting up 3 miles east of Clearwater," Dora said, and her voice had the particular careful quality of someone lowering a piece of dynamite. "The Whitmore boys said the man running it has been there since last fall, actually. That he bought the land outright and has been building the herd over the winter. They said his name is Rourke." Minnie went very still. Clearwater, Kansas was 11 miles from Caldwell. It was not Wichita. It was not 40 miles away. It was 11 miles, which was close enough that on a clear day, if the wind was right, you might practically shout across the distance. "Rourke," Minnie said. "They didn't know his first name," Dora said, watching Minnie's face with an expression that had moved from gleeful to cautious. "But I thought it worth mentioning. I thought it might be a coincidence. But then I thought about your letters and I thought, well, Minnie ought to know." Minnie thought about the post office box in Wichita. She thought about how a post office box was just a post office box, not an address, not a location. She thought about how a man who had bought land near Clearwater in the fall of 1881 might very well have set up his correspondence through a Wichita box, because that was where the Cattlemen's Association was headquartered. She thought about how 40 miles and 11 miles were very different numbers, and yet both could have the same post office box. "I need to think," Minnie said. "Yes," said Dora. "I imagine you do." After Dora left, Minnie went upstairs and sat on her bed and looked at the small stack of letters she kept tied with a blue ribbon in the drawer of her nightstand. She counted them. 31 letters over 7 months. 31 letters from a man she had imagined 40 miles away, who might have been 11 miles away the entire time. Who might, on any given market day or supply run, have been in Caldwell buying goods from the very store she ran, and neither of them had known. The feeling that moved through her was complicated. There was something that was almost like betrayal, though she could not rationally explain why, since he had listed Wichita in his registry information and she had never asked specifically where his land was. There was something that felt like foolishness, though she had not been foolish, she had simply not asked. And there was something underneath both of those that felt, if she was honest with herself, startlingly like hope. She did not write to him that day. She thought about what she wanted to say and what she wanted to know, and how to ask it without sounding accusatory when she did not actually feel accused. She thought about it for 4 days. On the 5th day she wrote him a letter, and it was the most directly she had ever addressed anything in their entire correspondence. She told him that she had heard a piece of news from a friend. She told him that she understood the association listed him as being of Wichita, and she had always assumed that meant he lived in or very near Wichita. She told him she had heard recently that there was a cattle operation run by a man named Rourke near Clearwater, which was considerably closer to Caldwell than Wichita was. She told him she was not accusing him of anything. She told him she simply needed to know. She sent the letter on a Friday and waited. The response came in 5 days, which for Clearwater to Caldwell should have taken perhaps 2, and she wondered if he had sat with it for a few days before writing back. When she opened it, her hands were not entirely steady. He wrote, "I owe you an honest answer and an apology, and I want to give you both." He wrote, "I did not deceive you intentionally." When I registered with the association, I listed Wichita because that was the nearest city, and the address I used was a post office box there that I had maintained since I worked in Abilene and used for business correspondence. I had recently purchased the land near Clearwater and was living in a temporary structure on the property while I built the house, and I did not list it as my address because I was embarrassed to say I was living in something that was barely better than a large shed at the time, and because it did not feel like a proper address to give to a stranger. He wrote, "I should have corrected it months ago. I kept meaning to and I kept not doing it, and that is entirely on me. I am sorry." He wrote, and I will tell you something else. I came into Caldwell 3 times in the past 7 months for supplies, once in November, once in January, and once in March. I did not know you worked in the dry goods store. I did not know which store was yours. I bought what I needed from Walker's Hardware and rode back. If I had known, I do not know what I would have done, but I know I would have wanted to know. He wrote, "I think the distance between us is probably 11 miles, not 40, and I think if you are willing, it might be time to talk about closing it." Minnie read that letter 3 times. Then she went downstairs and told Dora, who arrived 20 minutes later having apparently sensed something through the walls of her house across the street, and who listened to the whole thing with her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes doing a complicated series of expressions. "He was here," Dora said finally. "In January. You were both in town at the same time." "Possibly," Minnie said. "You might have walked past each other on the street." "Dora, I am just saying." Dora paused. "What are you going to do?" Minnie looked at the letter which she was still holding. She thought about 31 letters in 7 months, and a man who had a horse named Copper and a barn cat named General Grant, who was ungrateful but effective at his job, and who had told her that grief did not follow a schedule, and who had read the same battered copy of David Copperfield until the pages were held together by stubbornness. "I am going to write back," she said. She wrote back that evening. She wrote that she was not angry, which was true, or not primarily angry, which was also true. She wrote that she understood the particular shame of a temporary address, and that she would have done the same. She wrote that she appreciated his honesty when it came, and that she thought honesty that arrived a little late was still honesty. She wrote that she did not know exactly what she wanted yet, but that she knew she did not want to stop corresponding. And she wrote at the bottom of the page, in the careful, deliberate way she had approached every important thing in her life, "I think if you would like it, we might consider meeting. Not immediately, but perhaps soon." She sealed the letter and held it for a moment before she put it with the outgoing mail. His response was the fastest he had ever written. 3 days. She thought the ink was barely dry when it was posted. He wrote, "I would like it very much." He wrote, "I have been thinking about little else since I sent my last letter." He wrote, "I want to be clear about something. These 7 months of letters have meant more to me than I know how to say plainly. You have been the person I think about when I am trying to articulate something that matters to me. You have been the voice in the back of my head when I am making a decision. I do not know what that means exactly, but I know it is significant, and I know I have never felt it before." He wrote, "I propose this. I will come to Caldwell on the first Saturday in June. There is a hotel on the main street. I have seen it on my supply runs. If you are willing, we could meet in a public place, the hotel dining room or a street corner or wherever you are most comfortable, and we could simply see each other, just that. No promises beyond showing up." He wrote, "Tell me yes or no, and I will be guided by whatever you say." Minnie put the letter flat on the kitchen table and pressed both palms against it and breathed. The first Saturday in June was 3 weeks away. She told her father that evening. Harold Hadley had been having a decent stretch of days, sitting up in the evenings and eating at the proper table instead of in bed, and he listened to the whole story with the careful attention he had always given to things that mattered, his hands folded on the table and his eyes clear and sharp even when his body was not. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You like him?" "I do not know him," Minnie said. "Not in person." You know him in every way a person can be known before they are in the same room, her father said. And you like him, Minnie thought about it. Yes, she said. I do, Harold nodded slowly. Then you should meet him, he said. You should do it before another 7 months go by and you have made it more complicated than it needs to be. Minnie smiled at her father, which she had not done in a while, and it felt good. When did you become so decisive? When your mother was alive, she made all the decisive choices, Harold said. I have had to pick it up in her absence. He paused. Write him yes. She wrote him yes. The 3 weeks between her letter and the first Saturday in June were the longest weeks of Minnie's recent life. She found herself reviewing everything she had written over 7 months with a sudden and acute self-consciousness, wondering if she had said too much or said it in the wrong register, or created an expectation that the real her, the physical breathing version who got flour on her sleeves and had opinions about the correct way to organize a ledger, could not possibly fulfill. She had long and somewhat frantic conversations with Dora about what to wear. Wear the blue one, Dora said firmly. The one with the white collar. You always look your best in the blue one. What if he does not come? Minnie asked. He will come, Dora said, with the absolute confidence of someone whose own romantic life had resolved satisfactorily and who believed the universe generally behaved itself. What if he comes and we have nothing to say to each other? You have been talking for 7 months. You will have something to say. That is different. Writing is different. Minnie, Dora said, putting both hands on Minnie's shoulders in the way she did when she was about to deliver a judgment. You are the most capable woman I know. You have run a business by yourself for 3 years. You have managed your father's health and the store's accounts and this entire correspondence with more competence and grace than I could manage on my best day. You will not fall apart meeting one cattle rancher. He is not just one cattle rancher. No, Dora said, and her voice was gentler now. He is not, which is exactly why you should not be afraid. The Friday night before the Saturday, Minnie barely slept. She lay in her narrow bed above the store and listened to the town settle and breathe around her, the distant sounds of the saloon on the far end of the street, the occasional whinny from the livery, the wind moving through the gap in the eaves that she had been meaning to have repaired for 2 years. She thought about Clearwater and wondered what his house looked like now that he had finished building it. She thought about the horse named Copper and whether she would get to see it. She thought about what his voice sounded like. She had imagined it, in the way you inevitably do, as something steady and low, but she knew imagination had its limits. At some point before dawn she slept, and woke when the light was pale and flat through the window, and got up and washed her face in the basin and pinned her hair and put on the blue dress with the white collar, and went downstairs and opened the store and waited. He had said 10 in the morning, in front of the hotel. At 9:45 she turned the store sign to closed, which she had not done in a year on a day that was not Sunday or a holiday, and she told herself she would only be an hour and would be back before anyone important arrived to shop. She walked to the hotel, which was half a block down the main street and across from the livery, and she stood on the board sidewalk in front of it in the morning sun that was already warm with the promise of a hot June day, and she waited. She saw him before he saw her. He was coming up the street from the south, which was the direction that led toward Clearwater, and he was on a horse that was unmistakably the color of old Copper, and he was taller than she had pictured him, or at least he sat tall in the saddle, which was how you knew a man who had spent years on horseback. He was wearing a clean shirt, which she noticed immediately because it was the kind of thing you noticed when you knew someone had made an effort, and his hat was a good one, not showy but solid, the kind of hat that had seen genuine use. He had brown hair and strong features, and his eyes, when he pulled Copper to a stop at the post in front of the livery and dismounted and turned toward the hotel, were a particular shade of gray-green that she had not expected and that she found immediately arresting. He looked at her and stopped walking. She looked at him and found that she could not quite move either. It was perhaps 5 seconds of standing there looking at each other, which felt much longer, and then he crossed the street and came up onto the board sidewalk and stopped 2 feet in front of her and took his hat off, which was such a natural and unrehearsed gesture that it made her chest do something complicated. "Miss Hadley," he said. His voice was steady and low. "Mr. Rourke," she said, and her own voice was steadier than she expected, which she felt quietly proud of. He looked at her for another moment, and there was something in his expression that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it, as though he had been carrying a question all the way up the road from Clearwater and the answer had just presented itself. "You are exactly as I pictured," he said, and then looked faintly embarrassed by having said it aloud. "Is that a good thing?" she asked. "It is an excellent thing," he said. And then, because he seemed to be the kind of man who committed to whatever he started, he smiled. The smile was indeed, as he had once described it, embarrassingly large for a man who generally kept to himself. It changed his whole face. It made him look younger and more open, and like someone you wanted to keep talking to. Minnie smiled back before she could manage to do anything more measured. They went into the hotel dining room, which was modest but clean and had a woman named Mrs. Parris who ran it with a firm hand and who brought them coffee without being asked, and they sat across from each other at a table near the window and they talked. They talked for 4 hours. It was not like anything Minnie had expected. It was not awkward, and it was not stilted, and it was not the slightly desperate social performance she had feared. It was like talking to someone she already knew, which of course she did, in all the ways that mattered. They picked up threads that had been running through their letters for months and followed them into actual conversation, and new things came up that letters had not gotten to, and there were moments of laughter and moments of a quieter register. And at one point, he told her something about his father that he had not put in any letter, something small and specific and private, and she understood that he was choosing to say it to her because she was the person he said things to. She told him something about her mother that she had never said to Dora or to anyone. That her mother had died when Minnie was 12, and that what she remembered most was not the grief of it but a particular afternoon, 6 months before her mother got sick, when they had sat on the porch of the house they lived in before her father bought the store, and her mother had taught her to braid grass into small flat wreaths, and that Minnie still could not see prairie grass without thinking of it. She did not know why she told him that. She told him anyway. He listened the way he wrote, which was to say completely, "When Mrs. Parris came by the 3rd time to see if they needed anything and gave them a look that was partly amused and partly proprietary, Minnie looked at the clock on the dining room wall and realized it was nearly 2 in the afternoon. "I have to get back to the store," she said, with genuine reluctance. "I know," he said. He looked at the table for a moment. "Minnie." It was the first time he had used her given name aloud, and it landed in a way that was different from reading it. "Yes," she said. "Would you be willing to let me come back?" he asked. "Not in another letter, in person. I could come next Saturday if that would suit." She looked at him across the table, this man she had been knowing for 7 months through 31 letters and who was, she realized, even better in person than she had been afraid to hope. She thought about what her father had said about not making things more complicated than they needed to be. "Yes," she said, "that would suit very well." He rode back toward Clearwater at 2 in the afternoon, and Minnie stood in front of the hotel and watched Copper carry him down the street until they turned south and were gone, and she felt the particular pleasant ache of anticipation that is one of the finest feelings available to a human being. She went back to the store and turned the sign to open and was behind the counter within the hour, and every single customer who came in that afternoon got slightly more cheerful service than they were probably accustomed to. She wrote him a letter that evening anyway, because it was what she knew how to do and it felt like the right way to close the day. She wrote, "I am glad you came. I am glad you are real." He wrote back in 3 days, "I am very glad you are real too. I have been thinking about little else since Saturday." He came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. They walked the town together on the 3rd Saturday, which was a step up from the dining room in terms of visibility, and Minnie was conscious of the way people noticed them, the particular calibration of a small town's attention, which was fine and inevitable, and she found she did not mind it at all. On the fourth Saturday, he came with a purpose she could see in the careful way he was holding himself, that slight extra formality that a person adopts when they have decided something important. They walked south to the edge of town, where the board sidewalk ended and the prairie began, and he stopped at the edge of the grass in the late afternoon light and turned to look at her. The light was exactly as he had described it in his letters, warm and flat and turning everything gold. "I want to say something," he said. "All right," she said. "I have been thinking about how to say this for the past 3 weeks and I have not come up with anything particularly elegant," he said. "So I am going to say it plainly and trust that plain is better than elegant between us, because I think it always has been." "I think so too," she said, and her voice was quiet. "I am in love with you," Seth Rourke said, with the simple directness of a man who believed in honesty the way other men believed in religion. "I think I have been in love with you since the letter you wrote in April about watching your father, because that was the letter where I understood what kind of person you are, and the kind of person you are is the kind of person I have wanted to find for a long time." He paused. "I am not asking you to say it back right now if you are not there yet. I know 7 months is a long time and also not a long time. But I did not want to keep coming on Saturdays without saying it, because that felt like a kind of dishonesty I was not willing to keep." Minnie looked at him in the golden late afternoon light at the edge of the Kansas prairie, this man who had written to her in careful, honest words about grief and loneliness and the pink light of a dawn pasture, who had ridden 41 miles round trip for 4 consecutive Saturdays, who had taken his hat off when he first saw her as naturally as breathing. "I am there," she said. "I have been there for a while. I just did not want to put it in a letter before you did." He looked at her for a moment, and then that enormous smile broke across his face, and it was even better in the golden light, and he reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her, and it felt like the letters had been practicing for exactly this. They stood at the edge of the prairie in the fading afternoon and held hands, and it was quiet around them except for the wind moving through the grass, and it was one of those moments that a person understands is important while it is still happening, which is the rarest kind. He came every Saturday through June and into July. He came during the week sometimes if the ranch work allowed, which it increasingly did not as summer deepened, and the demands of cattle intensified. He helped her with 2 heavy deliveries that arrived at the store when she had no one to manage the lifting, and she met him once at the edge of his property outside Clearwater, and saw the house he had built, which was modest and square and solid and smelled of fresh pine, and the beginnings of something domestic. She met General Grant, the barn cat, who was indeed ungrateful and effective. He introduced her to Copper, who was 17 hands and beautiful, and allowed Minnie to stroke his nose with a kind of deliberate tolerance that she found charming. Seth stood beside her while she did it with his arms crossed and a look on his face that was quietly contented. Her father met Seth in July. Harold Hadley had been having a better summer than the previous winter, a stretch of relative steadiness that the doctor said was not to be taken for granted, but was to be enjoyed. He sat at the kitchen table when Seth came for supper, and he talked to Seth for an hour and a half with the full sharpness of his mind, asking about the cattle operation and the land and the business of running a modest ranch, and Seth answered everything directly and honestly and asked Harold questions in return, which Harold clearly appreciated. After Seth left, Harold said to Minnie, "He is a good man." "I know," Minnie said. "He is also clearly mad about you," Harold said. "In case you were wondering." "I was not wondering," Minnie said, and she was blushing slightly, which her father found entertaining. August arrived with the terrible heat of a Kansas summer, the kind of heat that baked the earth to pale, cracked clay and made the cattle restless and the people short-tempered. The trail drive slowed through Caldwell as the season wound toward its end, and the store had a certain exhausted character that was common to late summer, inventory low and orders slow to arrive. One August afternoon, a man came into the store whom Minnie did not know. He was thick-shouldered and weathered, and he had the look of someone who had spent a long time making trouble rather than avoiding it. And he wanted to buy whiskey, which the dry goods store did not sell, and he did not believe Minnie when she told him so, and said several things that were threatening and unpleasant while he leaned on her counter. The door opened before she could decide what to do, and Seth came in, because he had been in town and had seen through the window. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the doorway at his full height and looked at the man and said, "I think you should go." The man looked at Seth and made the kind of assessment that men who have spent time making trouble are good at making, and he left. Seth came and stood at the counter and looked at Minnie with an expression that was trying to be calm and not entirely managing it. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly fine," she said. "But thank you," he nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he said, "I need to talk to you about something." She waited. "I do not like that you are alone here," he said. "Your father cannot reliably come downstairs. There is no one else in the building during the day. I do not like it." "I have been managing this store alone for 3 years," she said, not defensively but clearly. "I know you have," he said. "You are the most capable person I have met. That is not what I am saying." He paused and looked at the counter and then at her. "I am saying that I am in love with you and I want to be the person who is here. I want that to be my right and my responsibility and the thing I come home to every evening. I want to ask you to marry me, Minnie, not because of what just happened. I have been building up to it for 2 months, and I am only doing it now instead of Saturday because I have run out of patience to wait until Saturday." Minnie looked at him standing in the doorway of her father's store in the August heat with his hat in his hand, and his face as open and honest as it had been in every letter he had ever written her. And she thought about the first Tuesday in October when his first letter had arrived, and how she had read it standing at this very counter because she could not wait long enough to go upstairs. "Yes," she said. He exhaled. It was a long breath, like a man who has been holding something heavy. "Yes," she said again, just to be clear. He came around the counter and took both her hands, and she thought he was going to say something. But instead, he just looked at her with that enormous smile doing its work on his whole face, and she thought she could look at that smile for the rest of her life without getting tired of it. They told Harold that evening. Harold received the news with a composure that suggested he had been expecting it and had already made his peace with it. And then he shook Seth's hand for a long time and told him that Minnie was the best thing he had done in 64 years of living. And Seth said he understood that and intended to honor it. And Harold nodded once as though a contract had been signed. They were married in October of 1882, exactly 1 year after the first letter. Dora cried for the entire ceremony, which was performed by the Reverend in the small white church at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street on a Saturday afternoon when the October light was the particular clear gold of a Kansas autumn, and the air smelled of dry grass and distance. Minnie wore a cream-colored dress that she and Dora had spent 3 weeks making, and Seth wore a dark coat that he had sent to Wichita for and which fit him well, and they stood in front of the Reverend and the assembled 20 or so people of Caldwell who had come because they were friends or customers or simply curious, and they said their vows with the seriousness and happiness that was appropriate to the occasion. When the Reverend said that Seth could kiss his bride, Seth did it with a care that was somehow both formal and deeply personal, his hands on either side of her face, and Minnie thought that this was the same hands that had held the pen that had written 31 letters, and the thought made the moment feel even larger than it already was. Dora's husband Tom, who was a steady and uncomplicated man, caught Minnie's hand after the ceremony and told her she had chosen well. Minnie agreed that she had. They celebrated in the hotel dining room where they had first sat across from each other 7 months before. Mrs. Paris made a real effort with the food and decorated the table with a ribbon, and Harold Hadley sat at the head of the celebration with more color in his face than he had shown in a year. And Seth sat beside Minnie and kept his hand over hers on the table in the straightforward way of a man who did not feel the need to be subtle about what mattered to him. They moved into the house near Clearwater. Minnie had made arrangements with a young man named Caleb Pike, who was 17 and reliable, to manage the store's daily operations under Harold's occasional supervision, with Minnie coming in twice a week to manage the accounts and the larger decisions. It was a compromise that satisfied everyone, including Harold, who said it gave him a reason to get downstairs in the morning. The house near Clearwater was modest and square and smelled of pine, and Minnie spent the first weeks making it habitable in the way that only someone who intends to stay can manage, putting curtains on the windows and a braided rug near the door and herbs drying from the kitchen rafters. Seth watched her do all of this with an expression of quiet satisfaction that she came to recognize as one of his characteristic expressions, the look of a man who cannot quite believe his luck but is trying to be dignified about it. He was up before dawn every morning, as ranching demanded, and she was up shortly after, and the mornings had a rhythm that was entirely their own, coffee at the small table, and the day's work organized between them in shorthand that developed rapidly between two people who pay attention to each other. She went to Caldwell on Tuesdays and Thursdays to manage the store accounts. He worked the cattle and the land and came in for the midday meal when he could and was never late for supper. In November, a cold snap came early and one of the heifers was in trouble with a difficult birth, and Minnie found herself at 2 in the morning helping Seth in the barn, holding a lantern and passing instruments and talking the frightened animal down with a steadiness that surprised Seth, though it should not have surprised him because by that point he knew what she was made of. The calf lived, which was a small miracle and felt like a good omen. In December, Harold had a difficult week. Minnie spent 3 days at the store to be close to him, sleeping in her old room above it, and Seth came every evening without being asked, bringing supplies and sitting with Harold in the evenings and talking cattle and business and occasionally arguing pleasantly about politics, which Harold enjoyed immensely because Harold had opinions and Seth was willing to engage with them rather than simply defer. Harold told Seth one of those evenings, while Minnie was in the kitchen, that he was grateful. Seth said there was nothing to be grateful for. Harold said, with the particular firmness of a man who had been managing his own affairs for 64 years, that there absolutely was, and that Seth should accept the gratitude graciously. Seth accepted it graciously. Christmas was quiet and good. They spent it at the house near Clearwater, with Dora and Tom coming for Christmas dinner and Harold being brought out in Tom's wagon, wrapped in 3 blankets and declaring the whole business unnecessary, and then clearly enjoying himself immensely once he arrived. Minnie made a roast and 2 pies and Seth cut a small cedar from the eastern pasture and stood it in the corner of the main room where it smelled wonderful for 3 weeks. After Christmas dinner, when the dishes were done and Harold was dozing by the fire and Dora and Tom were talking quietly in the corner, Seth pulled Minnie outside into the cold, clear night, and they stood on the porch and looked at the stars, which in a Kansas December are something that words do not fully reach, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood there for a long time without needing to say anything at all. This was, Minnie thought, what 31 letters had been building toward. Not the words, but the silence on the other side of them. In January of 1883, Seth received a letter from his sister Clara in Missouri. Clara was 24 and had recently been widowed, her husband having died of a fever in November, and the letter was quiet and sad and asked for nothing explicitly but asked for everything between the lines. Seth read it at the kitchen table and Minnie watched his face and understood before he said anything. She should come, Minnie said. He looked up. She would be staying with us. I know. You have not met her. I know you, Minnie said simply. That is enough. He looked at her for a moment with that particular expression that she had come to understand meant he was feeling something large and did not have a ready word for it. Then he wrote back to Clara and said, "Come." Clara Rourke arrived in February, a slight woman with Seth's same gray-green eyes and a composure that was clearly costing her something to maintain, carrying one trunk and a small satchel, and looking at the world with the careful fragility of someone recently broken who is determined not to appear so. Minnie received her at the door with coffee and a directness that she sensed was what Clara needed more than excessive sympathy. And by the second evening, they were talking in the kitchen while Seth was out with the cattle. And by the end of the first week, Clara had begun to use the house as if she belonged in it, which was exactly right. Clara helped in the store when she could, coming into Caldwell with Minnie on Tuesdays, and she had a quick mathematical mind that made the accounts go faster. And by March, she had found her footing sufficiently to smile without it looking like an effort. She stayed through the spring and into the summer, and then one afternoon in May she told Minnie that she was thinking of looking for a teaching position, that she had always wanted to teach, and Minnie took both her hands and said that was a very good idea. It was Minnie who went to the Caldwell School Board and made the case for Clara's qualifications, and it was a case she made well, because she had once wanted to be a teacher herself, and she knew exactly what arguments would land. Clara was offered a position starting in September, and when Seth heard, he had to go outside for a moment, and when he came back his eyes were overly bright, and he told Clara she had better be worth the school board's confidence, which was his way of saying he was proud of her. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The cattle operation had found its footing after its first full year, and Seth was expanding cautiously, adding to the herd, and repairing the fence line along the north pasture, and hiring a hand named Jonas Webb, who was 22 and capable, and who lived in a small bunkhouse that Seth built on the east side of the property. The store in Caldwell was stable, and Caleb Pike had grown into his responsibilities with a seriousness that was encouraging. Harold had a good summer, which was a gift none of them had been counting on. He came out to the ranch twice, which required planning and Tom's wagon and a great deal of logistical arrangement, but both times he sat on the porch and looked at the prairie with a satisfaction that Minnie recognized from her own early mornings, the look of a person who has found where they belong. In July, Minnie told Seth she was expecting a child. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where it seemed all the significant conversations of their marriage happened, the small pine table that had started as the only furniture in the house and had accumulated the weight of every important moment between them. He looked at her for a moment. Then he got up from the table and came around and put his arms around her from behind, his face against her hair, and said, "I need a minute." She put her hands over his arms and gave him the minute. When he spoke again, his voice was changed in the way that voices change when something too large and good has arrived. He said, "I am going to be somebody's father." "Yes," she said. "I need to fix the roof on the north side of the barn," he said with sudden urgency. "That can wait a few months," she said. "The fence along the creek needs reinforcing." "Seth." "Yes." "Sit down," she said. "Have some more coffee. The fence will wait." He sat down and had more coffee and looked across the table at her with the full weight of his feeling, and she looked back at him, and it was one of those moments that contained everything. Dora received the news with a shriek that startled her chickens. Clara received the news with a quiet and genuine joy that was different from Dora's but equally warm. Harold received the news in his chair by the window above the store and was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your mother would have been very glad," and that was the most important thing anyone said about it. The baby arrived in March of 1884, a boy, healthy and loud about it, with dark hair like Minnie and the beginnings of something around the eyes that might become gray-green. They named him Harold James Rourke, the Harold for Minnie's father and the James for Seth's. Seth held his son for the first time with the particular careful terror of a man who is immensely strong and is being trusted with something immensely fragile, and his expression was entirely unguarded in a way that Minnie filed away as one of the finest things she had ever seen. Harold Hadley met his grandson in April, coming out to the ranch in Tom's wagon for the occasion. He held the baby with the steady confidence of a man who had held a baby before, and he talked to him in the low conversational tone of someone who takes the intelligence of their audience seriously, and little Harold James looked up at his grandfather with the unfocused but intense attention of a very young person encountering the world. Harold Hadley died in June of that year, quietly and at home, on a good evening after a decent day. Minnie was with him. She had gone into Caldwell as she always did on Tuesdays and had sat with her father in the evening before coming home, and he had been tired but clear, and they had talked about the old house from before the store, the one with the porch where her mother had taught her to braid grass, and he had smiled at the memory and closed his eyes, and the smile had stayed when he was gone. She told Seth when she got home, and he held her for a long time without trying to make it better with words, which was the right thing to do, and she cried in the complete and necessary way that she had been not quite allowing herself to do for 3 years, because there had always been something to manage, and now there was nothing left to manage, and the grief came through the gap. She managed the burial arrangements with the same competence she brought to everything, and Seth stood beside her at the grave with his hand at the small of her back, and Dora and Tom were there, and Clara, and Caleb Pike, who had genuinely cared for Harold in his way, and a handful of Caldwell residents who had been customers and neighbors for years. The store passed to Minnie in Harold's will, as expected. She and Seth talked about what to do with it. The conversation took several evenings, because it deserved that kind of consideration. In the end, they decided that Minnie would continue managing the accounts and major decisions, that Caleb Pike would take on a more formal managerial role with a corresponding increase in his wages, and that the store would continue as it had been, which was as Harold would have wanted. It was a decision that suited Minnie, who found that having the store in her life was not a burden but a thing she had genuinely loved without fully recognizing it, until the question of keeping it arose. Autumn of 1884 brought the resumption of Clara's second year of teaching. She had discovered in her first year that she was genuinely gifted at it, that children's minds engaged her in a way that nothing since her husband's death had managed to. And she came home from school on the evenings she spent at the ranch bright and energized in the way of someone doing what they are meant to do. She had also, quietly and without announcing it, become friends with the Caldwell Reverend, a man named Thomas Aldrich who was widowed and about 35, and who had a scholarly bent and a tendency to visit the school with books he thought Clara might find useful. Minnie noticed before Clara said anything. Seth noticed shortly after Minnie did. They did not say anything to each other about it until one November evening when Clara had gone to bed, and they were alone by the fire, and then they had a quiet and amused and very loving conversation about their observational skills. Clara and Reverend Aldrich were married the following spring, in the same white church where Seth and Minnie had been married 3 years before. Minnie stood up with Clara and Seth walked his sister down the aisle, and the ceremony was simple and serious and right. Afterward at the celebration, Seth leaned close to Minnie and said quietly, "She is going to be all right," in the way that meant he had been worried for 2 years without saying so and was only now releasing it. "She has been all right for a while," Minnie said. "You have just been slower to see it." "That is probably true," he said. Baby Harold James, who was 14 months old and had recently discovered walking and was evangelical about it, made his way across the floor of the hotel dining room during the celebration with the focused intensity of someone who has a very important place to be, and Seth caught him with one easy hand just before he reached the door, and the look Harold James gave his father was one of such complete indignation that half the room laughed. The years settled into themselves after that, the way good years do, which is not without trouble or difficulty or the ordinary sorrows that a life accumulates, but with a foundational steadiness that holds when things lean against it. Jonah's Webb, the hand Seth had hired, turned out to be one of the best workers Seth had employed, reliable and skilled with cattle and horses and willing to learn. By 1885, Seth had taken him on as a full partner in the operation's expansion, having doubled the herd to over 200 head and taken on an additional 40 acres to the north. The cattle business in Kansas was changing. The great trail drives winding down as the railheads moved and the ranges filled. But Seth had been watching the change and planning for it, shifting toward a breeding operation that was less dependent on the volume economics of the trail and more focused on quality. Minnie had opinions about the business decisions, well-informed ones, because she had been managing a commercial operation for years and understood inventory and cash flow and the particular mathematics of thin margins. And Seth had learned early in their marriage that her opinions were worth the kind of attention that a man gives to a business partner he trusts absolutely. They talked about the ranch and the store together at the kitchen table with the same directness and mutual respect that characterized everything between them. In 1886, Minnie was expecting again. She told Seth with the comfort of familiarity, sitting at the kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, and he took the news with the same enormous response he had the first time, except now it was comfortably familiar, and he did not feel the need to go inventory the barn. He just took her hand across the table and said, "Harold needs a companion. He needs to learn to share first," Minnie said, because Harold James at 2 was a child with strong opinions about ownership. "He will figure it out," Seth said. The second child arrived in January of 1887, a girl this time, who arrived with her father's lungs and made her preferences known immediately. They named her Margaret, which had been Minnie's mother's name, and Minnie held her in the early morning after her arrival and thought about a porch and grass braided into small flat wreaths and felt the continuity of things. Seth held Margaret with slightly more confidence than he had held Harold James, which was the advantage of having done it before, and Harold James regarded his new sister from a careful distance for approximately 4 days before deciding she was acceptable, and thereafter was proprietary about her in the way of older siblings who have reversed course. The house near Clearwater had grown over the years. Seth had added a second room to the east when Clara lived with them, and after she left he had converted it to a proper study for Minnie's accounts work. And after Harold James was born, he had added a room to the north. And now with Margaret the house was full in the warmest possible sense, with children's voices and the smell of cooking and the comfortable noise of a family that is genuinely glad to be together. Dora visited often, as she always had, and Tom, and Clara and Reverend Aldrich came on Sundays when the Reverend was not needed elsewhere. Jonah's Webb had quietly become part of their extended community, a steady presence who helped celebrate good times and showed up without being asked in harder ones. In the spring of 1887, a delegation from the Caldwell Town Council came to see Seth about a matter he had not anticipated. The marshal, whose name was Briggs and who had served the town well for 3 years, was leaving to take a position in Wichita, and the council was looking for a replacement. They had asked around, and Seth Rourke's name had come up repeatedly, and they wanted to know if he would consider it. Seth listened to them with courtesy, thanked them for the consideration, and told them he needed to talk to his wife. He came home and told Minnie that evening, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things that mattered, and when he finished, she asked him 2 questions. The first was what his genuine feeling was about it. The second was whether it could be done alongside the ranch operation or whether it was a replacement for it. He said his genuine feeling was that it was a larger responsibility than he had expected to find himself facing, and that he was not sure he was the right person. She said she thought he was the exact right person, which was the kind of thing she said when she meant it precisely, and he had learned not to argue with it. He said the marshal's role was largely a town-based position, and that Jonas could manage the ranch operation on the ground if the partnership was properly structured. They talked about it for 3 evenings. On the 4th evening, Seth told the council he would take the position, on the condition that he could maintain his role in the ranch operation through his partnership with Jonah's Webb, which the council accepted. He was a good marshal for the same reasons he was a good man, which was that he was honest and steady, and understood the difference between force and authority. Caldwell in 1887 was not the wild and unsettled town it had been in the heyday of the trail drives, but it still had its troubles, disputes between cattlemen and farmers over fence lines and water rights, the occasional traveler with violent intentions, and the ordinary human frictions of a growing town. Seth handled all of it with the same direct and principled approach he brought to everything, and the town responded well. Minnie, for her part, was not surprised to find that she was proud of him in a way that was entirely uncomplicated, which was the best kind of proud. The store in Caldwell continued to thrive under the arrangement with Caleb Pike, who by 1887 was 23 and had grown into an impressive businessman with ambitions of his own that Minnie was happy to encourage. They talked about a formal partnership arrangement by the end of the year and settled it in early 1888, with Caleb taking a 30% ownership stake that he would buy out over 5 years, which worked well for everyone. The winter of 1888 was cold but not brutally so, and the house was warm, and Harold James, who was 4, had developed a passion for hearing stories that his father was called upon to deliver every evening with a seriousness and invention that Seth brought to the role with characteristic commitment. Margaret at 1 was beginning to talk, a few clear words that appeared without warning in conversations, startling everyone around her, and she had discovered the barn cat General Grant, who was getting old but had apparently made his peace with being adored by small people. On a February evening in 1888, Seth came in from the last barn check of the night and found Minnie at the kitchen table, which was where she always was in the evening, but she was not working on accounts. She had a sheet of paper in front of her, and she was looking at it with an expression he had come to recognize over 6 years of marriage as the one she wore when something had made her feel the full range of a thing. He sat down across from her. "What is that?" She slid it across the table. It was the first letter he had ever written her. She had kept them all in order, tied with the original blue ribbon, and she had clearly been going through them. He looked at the letter. He had not read it in years. He looked at his own handwriting, younger and a little stiffer than it was now, the formal, careful address of a man introducing himself to a stranger. "I was cleaning the drawer," she said. "I found them." He read the first letter. He read 3 or 4 more. He looked up at her. "I had a horse named Copper," he said, "and a barn cat named General Grant." "Copper is still in the barn," she said. "General Grant is asleep in front of the fire." "I know." He looked at her across the table. "I was writing to a woman I had never met." "You were writing to me," she said. "I did not know that yet." "No," she said, "but you were." He reached across the table and took her hand, the way he had 10,000 times in 6 years, and it still felt like something. She thought that was the thing about having chosen right. The ordinary gestures stayed true. They did not flatten with repetition. "What made you take them out tonight?" he asked. "I was thinking about Tuesdays," she said. "The first letter came on a Tuesday. I have always kept track of that, and it occurred to me tonight that I have not written you a letter in 6 years. "You have not needed to," he said. "I am here." "I know," she said, "but I was thinking about what it was like writing them. Having those months of just words, nothing else, no house to look at or expression on your face, just what you chose to put on the page. And I thought it was a remarkable way to know a person. I thought I knew you better from those letters than I might have from 6 months of ordinary social acquaintance." "I thought the same thing," he said. "And then I thought about how you were 11 miles away the whole time," she said, and she laughed a little, the kind of laugh that has a lot of other feelings running underneath it. He shook his head slowly. "I came into Caldwell and bought hardware and rode back home and had no idea." "You might have walked past me on the street," she said, which was what Dora had said years ago and which was still true. "I shudder to think," he said, which meant he loved thinking about it. She looked at him across the pile of old letters in the lamplight, this man she had chosen and who had chosen her, who was 4 years a marshal and a rancher and a father, and the person who was still, after all of it, the voice in the back of her head when she was making a decision. She thought about the woman who had sat at this very table the night before the first Saturday in June of 1882, barely able to sleep for nerves, imagining a stranger 40 miles away. "I want to write you a letter," she said. He looked at her with a slight smile. "I am sitting right here." "I know," she said. "I want to write you one anyway. I want to say the things you can only say in a letter." "All right," he said, and the smile was the large one, the one that changed his whole face, the one she had been looking at since that first Saturday in front of the hotel. She pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her and picked up her pen. She wrote the date at the top, February 1888, and then she wrote his name, and then she began. She wrote about October of 1881, about a slow Tuesday afternoon in a dry goods store when a letter had arrived, and she had read it standing at the counter because she could not wait. She wrote about the strange, intimate technology of correspondence, the way you offered yourself on paper in ways you could not always manage in person, the way receiving someone's words on a page was its own kind of presence. She wrote about how she had imagined him 40 miles away, and how that distance had felt exactly right for the stage she was in, the careful, slow unfolding of knowing someone, and how finding out he had been 11 miles away the whole time had felt like the universe being both clever and slightly ridiculous. She wrote about that first Saturday in June, about seeing him come up the street on Copper, the clean shirt and the good hat and the gray-green eyes, about how he had stopped walking when he saw her, about how he had taken his hat off, about how his voice had been exactly as she had imagined it. She wrote about the 4 hours in the hotel dining room, and about standing at the edge of the prairie in the late afternoon light when he had told her he was in love with her, about how she had said she was there too and had been for a while. She wrote about every Saturday of that summer, and about meeting Copper and General Grant, and about her father meeting Seth and saying he was a good man, and about the October wedding in the white church with the light coming through the windows in flat gold columns. She wrote about the house near Clearwater and the mornings at the small pine table, about the difficult calf born in November and the 3 days of snowstorm in January, and the supper she burned the first week because she had been too interested in the accounts to watch the pot. She wrote about Harold James arriving in March of 1884, about Seth's careful terror holding his son for the first time, about Harold Hadley and the grass wreaths and the quiet June evening, about Clara finding her footing, about Margaret and her father's gray-green eyes. She wrote for an hour. When she finished, the letter was 4 pages, which was the longest she had written since the depth of their correspondence, and her hand ached pleasantly. She folded it and wrote his name on the outside. She slid it across the table. He picked it up and opened it and read it at the kitchen table by the lamplight while she sat across from him and watched his face, which was all the reply she needed even before he got to the end. When he finished, he folded the letter along the original creases with the same care he always gave to things he intended to keep, and he looked up at her. "I am going to put this with the others," he said. "That is where it belongs," she said. He got up and went to the drawer where she kept the letters, the full collection with its blue ribbon, and he tucked the new one in at the end, and he put the ribbon back, and he closed the drawer. He came back to the table and sat down and looked at her across the lamplight in the house they had built, in the territory they had both separately chosen, in the life that had assembled itself from 31 letters and 11 miles that had taken a year to close. "Minnie," he said. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something." "You are allowed," she said. "You generally say good things." He leaned forward on his elbows, the way he did when he was being direct, and he said, "I think about the man I was when I wrote that first letter, 26 years old and living in something that was barely a house and not at all sure what I was doing, and thinking that writing to a stranger seemed like a reasonable thing to try because nothing else was presenting itself. And I think about the fact that she was 11 miles away." He shook his head. 11 miles. "I had ridden that road 100 times. It was the right distance," she said. "The letters needed the distance. That is an extraordinarily generous way to look at it. I am an extraordinarily generous person." He smiled. "You are the best person I know," he said, and he said it simply, without decoration, the way he said things that he meant absolutely. She felt that land the way it always did when he said something true. "And I know some good people," he added. "Jonas is a decent man. Tom is steady. Reverend Aldrich knows his David Copperfield." "Do not diminish the moment," she said. "I am not diminishing it," he said. "I am just saying that I have a reference point for good people and you are the best of them." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, the February wind moved across the Kansas prairie with its long, familiar sound, the sound that had been there every morning she had stood at the edge of the world and felt something wordless and enormous. The fire was low in the grate. General Grant, gray and elderly and ungrateful, had rearranged himself into a more comfortable position in front of it. Somewhere in the other room, Harold James was asleep with the healthy confidence of a 4-year-old who trusted his world completely, and Margaret was in her crib with her father's eyes closed. "I want to tell you something," Minnie said. "Something I have been thinking tonight while I was going through the letters." "All right," he said. "When I joined the Pen Pal program, I was embarrassed about it," she said. "Not ashamed, exactly, but embarrassed. It felt like an admission that I had not managed to find what I was looking for through ordinary means, and there was a part of me that thought ordinary means were the respectable ones." She paused. "And I think I have thought about that on and off ever since, because our whole story begins with that. This slightly embarrassing arrangement where you write to a stranger through an association because you are lonely and hoping for something." "And," he said, "and I have decided that it is actually the best story I know," she said. "Because what it means is that we both chose each other before we had anything to go on except words. We did not choose each other because of what we looked like, or what we owned, or who our families were, or any of the usual things. We chose each other based entirely on what we had to say and how we said it. And that turns out to be the truest possible basis for everything that came after." He looked at her for a long moment with the full and quiet weight of a man who has found his place in the world and knows it. "That is exactly right," he said. "I know it is," she said. "I wrote it in the letter." He laughed then, the large, embarrassing laugh that was not embarrassing at all, the one she had been hearing for 6 years, and it was still the best sound in whatever room it was in. Outside, the February wind kept its long song across the prairie, and the stars over Kansas were the particular brilliant kind that a clear, cold night produces. And in the barn, Copper stood in his stall with the patient calm of a horse who has carried his rider well and been well kept in return. And the house sat square and warm and lit in the darkness, with the kind of light that comes from something genuinely inhabited. In the spring, Minnie discovered she was expecting a third child, and she told Seth on a Tuesday because that was the day for important news, and he received it with the same wholehearted joy. He had always brought to the fact of their family, slightly steadier now than the first time but no less full. The third child arrived in November of 1888, another boy, dark-haired and loud, who was named Thomas for Dora's husband, who had been steady and good to them for years, and who arrived on a Tuesday, which Minnie took as a sign that the universe had a sense of continuity. Harold James at 4 was proprietary about Thomas exactly as he had been about Margaret, though with slightly more practice. Margaret at nearly 2 regarded the new baby with the scientific interest of a person conducting a study. Seth held Thomas with the easy confidence of a man who had done this before, and his expression this time was joyful without the terror, which was the advantage of the third time. Dora cried when she met Thomas. This was expected. Clara and Reverend Aldrich had a child of their own by then, a girl named Ruth who was 8 months old, and who Clara carried to the christening with the comfortable assurance of a woman who had found, after everything, a life that fit her. Jonas Webb, who had quietly become the closest thing to a best friend Seth had outside his own household, stood as godfather to Thomas, and made a speech at the celebration that was short and honest and very good, which was consistent with his character. In 1889, the Oklahoma Territory was open to homesteaders, and the West shifted again as it always did, restless and enormous and never quite done becoming itself. Caldwell, which had lived by the cattle trail, was finding new reasons to exist as the region developed, and Seth's martial role was evolving with the town, more concerned now with the civil disputes of a growing community than with the violent disruptions of the trail era. The store under Caleb Pike's management had done well enough that Caleb was into the third year of his buyout arrangement and ahead of schedule. Minnie reviewed his accounts on Tuesday afternoons with the same thorough attention she had always brought to it, and she and Caleb had developed the easy professional respect of two people who are genuinely good at the same thing. She was 30 years old in 1889, which felt to her not old but full, in the way that 30 feels when you have done things with your 20s rather than simply passed through them. She had a husband she loved and who loved her with a directness and steadiness that she had not known to expect and that she was grateful for every day. She had 3 children who were healthy and themselves and already interesting. She had a business and a community and a house that was hers in the deepest sense. She thought on a quiet Tuesday morning in the spring of 1889, exactly what she had been hoping for without quite knowing how to say it, when she had sat at Dora's kitchen table drinking strong tea and being persuaded to write a letter to a stranger. Seth came in from the morning's work just as she was thinking this, pulling off his hat at the door and hanging it on the hook, and coming to the kitchen for coffee with the comfortable familiarity of a man in his own house, and he looked across the kitchen at her with the gray-green eyes that she had not imagined, and yet which had become one of the most familiar sights in her life. "What are you thinking?" he asked. He always knew when she was thinking something that mattered. "I am thinking it was a very good Tuesday," she said. He poured his coffee and raised an eyebrow. "It is a Wednesday." "I mean 6 years ago," she said. "When the first letter came, it came on a Tuesday." I always remembered it. He came and sat down at the table across from her, the small pine table that had been there since the beginning, that had held coffee cups and account books and 31 letters, and one long reply written on a February night, that had been the geography of every important conversation between them. "You have never told me that," he said. "I know," she said. "I am telling you now." He looked at her with a smile that began slowly and built to the one that changed his whole face, and she thought that was one of the permanent miracles of her life, that she had not gotten tired of that smile. She was fairly certain she never would. "It was a very good Tuesday," he agreed. Outside, the Kansas spring was doing its lavish best, the prairie going green and extravagant, the sky the specific blue that had no competing description, and the house near Clearwater sat in the middle of it, all with its windows open to the morning, and its door hung wide, and 3 children's voices already in full operation from the other rooms, and Copper in the pasture and General Grant on the porch in the sun. Old and slow and resident of a life that had been built with care from nothing but 40 acres and a letter written on a Tuesday in October, and the belief that words on a page were enough to begin. They were. They had always been enough. They were, in fact, everything. Seth reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat in the morning light of an ordinary and extraordinary day in the spring of 1889, and the story that had started with a letter to a stranger was nowhere close to finished, but it was deeply, completely, permanently itself. Minnie looked at her husband across the kitchen table and thought of the first line she had ever written him. "My name is Minnie Hadley, and I live in Caldwell, Kansas, where I run my father's dry goods store and have more opinions about ledger organization than anyone around me finds interesting." He had written back, "I think the right person would find it very interesting." He had been correct. He was, as it turned out, the right person, and he had been 11 miles away the entire time, and neither of them had known, and somehow that made it better rather than worse. It made it feel like something that was always going to happen, like something that the distance and the letters and the slow, deliberate accumulation of words had been preparing them for, so that when they finally closed the 11 miles between them, they were already, in every way that mattered, home.